The relay station sat at the bend of the Vermilion Trail, where the land flattened out in every direction and gave the wind nowhere to go but through. She had learned this in her first winter running it alone, when the cold came sideways across the flats at 3 in the morning and found every gap in the chinking she hadn't found herself. That was 2 years ago. She knew the gaps now. She had sealed them with horsehair and oakum, and the patience her husband had left her, which was the one thing of his she had managed to hold on to without it costing her something each time she reached for it. It was the 3rd week of November, 1887, and the snow had come early. Not the tentative first snow that sometimes blew in before October was done and melted back into the grass before anyone had to decide what to make of it, but the kind that arrived low and deliberate and intended to stay. She had 4 horses to feed, a roof over the tack room that leaked at the east seam, and enough salt pork in the cellar to last a careful winter. She had gotten good at careful. She was splitting wood behind the barn when the dog went quiet. A dog that barked was announcing something. A dog that went silent was paying attention. She had been paying attention to this dog for 2 years, and she set the axe on its head and looked toward the tree line at the edge of the yard. The man came out of the spruce at the far side of the fence on foot, a canvas pack over one shoulder and a bedroll lashed beneath it. He moved without hurry, but without the deliberate slowness of a man, pretending he wasn't tired either. He moved like someone who had covered a great deal of ground and had made his peace with covering more before he stopped. He halted at the yard post. He did not come through the gate. He took off his hat, not in greeting exactly, more as a way of letting her see his face without obstruction. Relay still taking in travelers? When there's a stage. She kept her hands where they were. There won't be another until Thursday. I'm not after passage. He held the hat in both hands, looking for work if there's any going. I know horses, no tack. I can see from here you've got a board loose on the tack roof. She looked at him the way she looked at any proposition she wasn't certain about. Without hurry, without welcome, taking in what there was to take in. He was weathered in the way of men who had spent more time outside than in. His hands, what she could see of them, were a working man's hands. He didn't shift his weight under the looking, which she took as a better sign than if he'd smiled. I can't pay. I didn't ask for pay. His eyes moved briefly to the lean to where the firewood was stacked, a man measuring the work without meaning to. Board in the barn loft. That's the whole of it. Above the tack room, the loose board lifted in the wind and clapped back down against the shingles. She had been meaning to nail it since August. She had not planned to say yes. She had planned to think it overnight and decide in the morning, the way she decided most things. But she was tired of that sound, and she was tired of cold air finding the chinking, and she was more tired of supper set for 1 than she had admitted to herself until just now. The tack roof first, she said, then we'll see about the rest. He nodded once. It was the nod of a man accepting terms, not accepting charity. Lofts through the side door, she said. Blankets on the hook. She picked up the axe and went back to the wood, and he went to the barn without being shown the way, and she did not turn to watch him go. He found the seam in the tack roof without being told where to look. She heard him at first light the next morning, moving on the slope overhead in the way of a careful man on frost-slick shingles. Test the weight, shift, test again, and by the time she had the stove going and the coffee on, he had already located the fault and was working the bad shingles back with a pry bar. She brought him a cup at mid-morning. He took it without turning from the fascia board he was working loose, both eyes on the nail he was backing out. And she understood this not as rudeness, but as the economy of a man who did not spread his attention thin when he had something in his hands. Tar paper underneath was laid the wrong direction, he said. Every melt ran under the overlap instead of over. Been happening since it was put on. My husband put it on. He said nothing to that. He drank the coffee and passed the cup back and went on with the board. She went back inside, grateful he hadn't offered condolences. He had no real footing to offer. That night, the tack room was quiet. The creak and flex of the old seam was simply gone. The way a sound you've stopped noticing only becomes apparent in its absence. She lay in bed and listened to the silence where it had been, and understood that this was the first repair done to the station in 2 years that she hadn't managed herself. And she did not know what to make of that feeling exactly, only that it was there. The days found a shape she hadn't had since before her husband died. He was at the water trough each morning before she was, breaking the night's ice and priming the pump before the freeze could set in the pipe below grade. He had worked out the priming himself. Hot water from the stove kettle, poured slow into the head, without once asking how hot. She watched him do it on the second morning, and understood that he had either done it before, or he was the kind of man who worked backward from the problem to its cause, without needing to be pointed at the beginning. He ate at the end of the table, not across from her. He thanked her for the plate without making a performance of the thanks. They did not talk through meals, and the silence sat between them without weight, which was not what she had expected and was more than she was prepared to name. He saw what needed doing without being told, a hinge on the barn door that had been listing since October, the water bucket that had sprung a split along the stave, the stall partition that had a crack she'd been stuffing with rag. He worked through these things one at a time without comment, and she began to understand that this was not eagerness, but simply the way he moved through a place, noting what was wrong and fixing it in order, the way a man reads a ledger column by column without skipping to the bottom. In the second week, he spread the harnesses across the sawhorses and began working through the damage the dry fall had done to the traces and throat latches. She patched grain sacks at the far end of the barn, and they shared the same cold air for hours at a time and said perhaps 20 words between them. And she found this easier than the silences she had spent 2 years sitting inside alone, which had a different quality entirely, the silence of one person in a space built for two. It was while he was working the second trace end that she noticed the coat. He had it folded over the nail inside the loft ladder, lining out, and something was stitched into the lining at the collar. Not letters, not a name, but a notation she recognized because her husband had used the same system in his survey work years back. A township and range reference. Land coordinates, specific enough to mean one particular place on the earth and no other. She said nothing. She filed it the way she filed most things she wasn't ready to address, carefully, without pretending she hadn't seen it. But she thought about it that night. She thought about what it meant to carry a land location stitched inside a collar rather than written on paper. Paper could be taken. The inside of a coat was harder to search without already knowing what you were looking for. The boy Rory came from the way station on a Thursday, arriving on his mother's mare and bringing her thread order, and the particular inability of 11-year-old boys to carry information without distributing it along the route. While she signed his receipt, he told her, in the easy manner of someone reporting on weather, that 2 men had come into the way station the afternoon before asking about a traveler. Quiet type, good with horses and equipment, came south from the North Country several weeks back. Pa said they didn't have badges, Rory said, but they carried themselves like they were used to having them. She finished signing. She gave him the coin and said nothing, and watched him ride back up the trail. She did not go to the barn immediately. She went inside and set the thread in the sewing basket and stood at the kitchen window until the yard stopped feeling different from how it had looked an hour ago. Then she made the coffee. Then she went out. He was at the workbench with a punching iron and a trace end that needed a new hole cut, and he didn't look up when she came in. She set the cup down beside him. He said thank you without stopping the iron. She stayed. A boy came from the way station, she said, when the silence had stretched long enough to be a choice. Said there were men there yesterday asking about someone from the north. Quiet fellow, good with horses and tack. He set the iron down. He picked up the buckle and fitted it to the leather and tested the alignment with his thumb. That right, he said. It was not a question. That's what he said. He picked up the coffee. He held it in both hands and looked past the workbench at the barn wall. You can ask me, he said. I haven't asked yet. A moment. The wind moved against the boards outside, low and patient. There was a dispute over a land claim, he said, up near the Clearwater country north of here. Timber rights. A syndicate out of Montreal wanted the tract and the family holding the claim wouldn't sell. He paused. The syndicate sent men. They burned the buildings, the house, the barn, the winter feed. Made it look abandoned, like the family had walked away of their own choice. Another pause, shorter. I was there working survey line for the summer. I saw it happen. They needed me to say I hadn't. She waited. I wouldn't sign their statement. She looked at the coat on the loft ladder nail. The land in your collar, she said. That's the claim. He looked at her directly then, a real look, the kind he hadn't offered before. Township 17, he said. Range 9. There's a boundary stake with a survey cap on it, still in the ground where I set it the summer before. It proves where the legal boundary runs. The family is in Red Deer now, boarding with a cousin. They can't get the claim back without a witness and a record of where the marker stands. She held this the way she held things she was still measuring. And the men who burned it, she said, they're the ones looking. Them, or men they hired. She picked up the empty cup. Then it matters that you're still here in the spring, she said. When the trail opens properly and you can get yourself to someone who can record what you know. She walked to the barn door. Supper in an hour. She crossed the yard without looking at the trail, because she had decided not to start looking until she had reason to. A rider came through on a Wednesday, on the far side of the trail fence, not turning in, just moving at the pace of a man going somewhere without urgency. He slowed as he passed the relay yard. He looked at the barn. He looked at the fence line where the new posts were going in, one at a time, driven deep the way posts were driven by someone who understood what frost did to shallow work. She was on the porch. She watched the rider the way she watched the horizon, steadily without making anything of it. At supper, he angled his chair slightly toward the window. She noticed this the way she'd noticed the coat. Not the first time it happened, but the second when the pattern confirmed itself. She did not comment. There was a blizzard building in the northwest sky, the kind she could feel in the way the horses had been moving in the barn all afternoon, restless and close to the walls. She had enough to think about. That evening, the mild air held long enough that she took her mending to the porch. He came out after a while and sat on the step below her with his coffee, and they were quiet in the way they'd been quiet all week. Not the absence of talk, but the presence of two people who had stopped requiring it. Those men are going to come here, she said. Probably. I'd rather know what I'm dealing with before they do. He turned the cup on his knee once. A small adjustment, a quarter turn and back. The syndicate is called the Barreau Company, he said. The men they use were constables once, before they were let go. They know how to carry themselves like law. They won't arrest me. They want the statement signed, or they want me somewhere. I can't speak to anyone who'd know what to do with what I saw. She pushed the needle through the mending. And the family. Lost everything. His voice was even and flat in the way of something said so many times it had worn smooth. A family of 5. The children were inside when the men arrived. They got out. He stopped. Barely. She bit the thread, pulled a new length. Then it matters more that you stay. She did not look up. It isn't just about you. He said nothing for a while. Above them the sky had gone dark in the northwest in the way that meant the blizzard would arrive before morning. You're asking me to stay, he said. I'm saying it makes sense for you to. She folded the mended section back. Whether you stay is your own business. He finished his coffee and held the empty cup and looked at the trail where it ran north into the trees and then bent out of sight. I built nothing here worth running from, he said quietly as if to himself. Then to her, I'll stay. She nodded once, the way a person nodded when a thing was settled that had already been settled and just needed saying. The Barrowed men arrived on a Monday, 2 of them on road-tired horses, riding with the unhurried certainty of men who had already decided how the afternoon would go. She heard the gate creak and came around the side of the house to meet them in the yard before they had the chance to choose where to stand. They were polite the way men were polite when they intended to have what they came for, regardless. The taller one did the talking. He described a man, gave the particulars. Quiet, capable with horses and tools, came down from the north country. Said there was a legal matter, said the man was a necessary witness. She listened to all of it. Men come through the relay regular enough, she said. I don't always take names. This one was on foot, the second man said. He was watching the barn. Foot traffic, too. I had a fellow helped me with fence posts and some harness repair a week and a half ago. Quiet type, good with his hands, he moved on once the work was done. The second man looked at the fence line. The new posts standing straight and dark against the frozen ground, the top rail in place. The work looked finished and weathering, which it was. Where'd he go? Didn't say. She offered this without apology, the way she would have offered it if it were simply true. Men who work for board and move on don't usually account for themselves. The taller man studied her. She held his eyes without effort. She had looked at harder things. You'd tell us, he said, nearly a statement, not quite. I'd tell you, she said. The blizzard had left the trail rutted, and the yard mud frozen into rough peaks, and the horses shifted on it, unhappy with the footing. Neither man moved for long enough that she counted her own pulse, steady and slow, and then the second man said something low to the first, and the first folded the paper he'd been holding back into his coat, and they turned their horses and rode out through the gate without looking back. She stood in the yard until the hoofbeats thinned to silence in the cold air. She gave it another full minute. Then she turned. He was in the barn doorway with a curry brush in one hand. His face was the careful, still face she had learned did not mean emptiness. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know it. She picked up the water bucket she'd set down when they arrived. I've had practice saying things I've already decided. He looked at her a moment longer. She went to the house. That night, she took the cedar box from under the bed and sat with it at the kitchen table. She had not opened it in months. Inside, under her husband's good watch, was a small account book in his handwriting. Freight columns, dates, and a series of payments made to a man named Pruitt in Brockton that she had never been able to account for. She had found it in his coat pocket after the funeral and had put it here and had carried the not knowing of it ever since. She read it through now, all of it straight through without stopping. The columns, the sums, the careful handwriting that had been his from the first letter he ever sent her. She did not know for certain what the payments had been. She had her guesses. She had stopped herself from guessing too far because there was no one left to ask who would know, and some silences she had come to understand had been protective of someone. Her husband had been a careful man. Careful men had reasons. She closed the book. She put it back in the box. She thought about coordinates stitched into a coat collar, about a family boarding with a cousin in Red Deer, about what it cost a man to refuse to sign something he knew was false, and to keep refusing while men followed him south for months. She thought these were not the same kind of silence, but she thought they were both the kind carried by people who had decided something and lived with the deciding. She set the box back under the bed. She went to the window. The yard was dark and still under the quarter moon, the snow lying blue and even over the fence line, over the new posts, over the trail running north. The barn was quiet, no lamplight in the loft. She thought about the spring, about the trail when it opened, about the kind of long stretch of time that didn't feel like waiting. In the morning, the coffee was already made. He was at the door pulling on his coat when she came downstairs, heading out to the horses the way he did each day before full light, and he paused with one hand on the latch and looked back at her, just briefly, just a look, and then he went out into the cold blue morning yard. She poured both cups. She set his by the window where the early light came through, and she stood at the stove with hers and looked out at the yard. The trail was empty. It would stay empty for weeks, maybe longer. She had enough wood for the winter and more work than she could finish before the snow gave way, and the snow was a long way from giving way. She had stopped minding that. When he came back in from the horses, she was at the table with the mending basket, and his cup was still steaming by the window. He sat down across from her, not at the end of the table where he had been sitting since the first week, but directly across, the way a person sat when they had stopped being a guest and started being something else. And he wrapped both hands around the cup and let out a slow breath, the kind that had been held for a while. She did not say anything about the chair. The snow started before noon, soft and unhurried, settling over the yard and the fence line and the trail without wind, covering everything slowly, making the world go quiet in a way she used to find unbearable. She had stopped finding it unbearable.